All right, welcome back. So before we get started, let's go over the course outline and the course objectives so you know what to expect from the course. So let's jump on the computer and let's go over the course outline.
So the best way that you can see a complete list of all the lectures that are going to be included in the course is to download this PDF, which is available with the lecture resources. And in here, I basically just begin by talking a little bit more about myself, just some of my background, as well as some of the professional engineer licenses that I have here in the United States. But if you scroll down, you'll see towards the bottom that we get into the course outline. So this is basically just a complete list of all the lectures that are included in the course. So we'll begin in section 1 of the course with simply a course introduction. We'll have a welcome to the course lecture. We'll have an about your instructor lecture where I talk a little bit more about myself. And then we have this lecture, which is the outline and objectives lecture, where we're going to go over all the lectures of the course. And then in section 2 of the course, we get into MATLAB Simulink. So we'll start by just giving an introduction to what MATLAB Simulink is. So that's going to be this lecture over here, and we'll talk a little bit more about how MATLAB Simulink can be used and some of the different applications. So we'll go over how to download and install MATLAB Simulink, just so that you have the latest version of MATLAB Simulink. And again, there's a free version available online that you can use for 30 days as a free trial that you can use to follow along with this course. So then we'll talk about how to launch MATLAB in what's called the MATLAB environment. So basically the different windows that you see within MATLAB. And then we'll do the same thing for Simulink. So we'll launch Simulink, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the Simulink environment, basically all the tools and all the things that you can do within Simulink. Now in section 3 of the course, then we'll talk about how we can use MATLAB for science and engineering specifically. So again, this course is focused on how to use MATLAB and Simulink, but for science and engineering applications specifically. So we'll begin by talking about how we can enter commands within MATLAB, so very basic. We'll talk about how to define variables, how to define vectors, and how to do basic arithmetic operations and basic matrix operations. And then we'll talk a little bit about trigonometric functions. So we'll start talking a little bit about more complex topics. So we'll begin by talking about trigonometric functions, and then we'll create a 2D plot, and we'll also talk about how we can edit plots. So this can be used to plot any 2D plot where you have an X and a Y axis. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to edit it, how to change some of the fonts, how to change the graphics, basically all the details about the 2D plots within MATLAB. And then after that, we're going to move into talking about 3D plots. And again, we'll start by just creating a 3D plot, and then we'll talk about how we can edit a 3D plot. And then lastly, we'll talk about how we can do programming within MATLAB Simulink, or rather within MATLAB more specifically. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can do programming, but we'll start by talking about for loops and if and else statements. So very basic programming functions, but again, the idea here is not to talk necessarily about programming per se, but rather how we can use MATLAB to do programming. So we'll show you how to do for loops and if and else statements, just as an introduction on how you can use MATLAB for programming. And then lastly, we'll talk about how to navigate the help menu. So basically, if you have any questions that come up while you're doing things within MATLAB, I'll show you how you can go into the help menu and get the information that you need. And then we'll finish up the section by doing 2 projects. So we'll make use of everything we've learned up to that point to do 2 different projects. The first one is going to be how to display the Fourier series of a square wave. So this is going to be a very complex project, but we'll go over it step by step. And then lastly, we'll do another project on how to calculate the roots of polynomials using MATLAB commands. So again, these are just 2 applications in which you can use MATLAB for practical applications. Now in section 4 of the course, we'll talk about Simulink as opposed to MATLAB. So we'll start by talking about what's called the library browser. This is basically where you get all of your components that you're going to put into models in Simulink. We'll talk about libraries for generic operations, so like addition, subtraction, multiplications, that kind of stuff. And then we'll get into more specifically how we can use Simulink for engineering applications. So we're going to focus on both electrical components and mechanical components. But again, this is just going to give you an introduction of how you can use Simulink for engineering in general. So we'll talk about how to build models, how to manage signals, how to run simulations and the different types of simulations that you can run, and then also, of course, how to take measurements when you run simulations, which of course is very important because once you run a simulation, to be able to see the results, you have to take measurements within your simulation. So we'll talk about that because again, it's very important. And then lastly, we'll talk about how you can interface MATLAB commands, or rather MATLAB functions, within Simulink, which is something else that you can do to kind of take MATLAB code and put it into Simulink to enhance your Simulink models. And then lastly, of course, we're going to talk about some projects to make use of what we've learned up to that point. So we'll do 3 different projects. The first one is going to be how to simulate a bouncing ball. And then we're going to talk about how to build a simple electric circuit. And we'll finish up with simulating an electronic bandpass filter. So this is going to be a somewhat complex project, but again, we'll talk about it and we'll go through it step by step. So as you can see, this is a very thorough course. We'll talk about how we can use both MATLAB and Simulink for science and engineering applications. All right, so now that we've talked about all the lectures that are going to be included in the course, let's go ahead and get started with the course.